Hi, everyone. Welcome to the season finale of the Community Relations Corner. My name is Gary Rosenblatt, and I'm the former editor and publisher of the Jewish Week. And it's an honor and a pleasure for me to host today's program. Uh, as you well know, on other occasions, Michael Miller, who's Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, has served as the host where he discussed issues of concern to New York's Jewish community with friends and partners all over the city. Today, to wrap up this season of The Corner, uh, the tables have been turned, and I will be interviewing Michael as he's about to step down from his current position, which he's held for over 36 years, and assume the title of CEO Emeritus. So, Michael, we're going to have a chance to talk about your life, the work you've done, your perspective on the Jewish community relations, and it's a great opportunity for you to speak frankly at this stage. And maybe we should start with your background, and I'm honored to have known your dad when I was a student at Yeshiva University around the time that you were. And so I'm sure that you grew up with Jewish community relations and synagogue relations running through your veins. But maybe you can talk a little bit about what that was like at home and how you got interested in the field.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Gary, for conducting this interview. Indeed, we've known each other for a very lengthy period of time, going back to our college days. And my home, or our home, my older brother, my two younger sisters, and I, my mother and my father, it was a Jewish communal home. My father was a rabbi in the Bronx, the northern part of the Bronx, the Kingsbridge Heights section. An Orthodox rabbi in a very large congregation. But my dad was never satisfied exclusively with being a pulpit rabbi. And your father and my father were colleagues. Your father in Annapolis, my father was originally from Baltimore.
Right.
So again, the families have known each other for a lifetime or two lifetimes. And one additional point is that one of your sons was a classmate with our son in elementary school at Yeshiva in Bergen County. So again, it's three generations as opposed to two. Back to the point is that my father was never satisfied to just be a rabbi. He was most interested in the Jewish community and being of service. He was of service during World War II as the United States Army Air Corps chaplain. And he continued his relationship with the chaplaincy and with the American rabbinate, the American Modern Orthodox Rabbinate, rising eventually to become the president of the Rabbinical Council of America, and become involved in multiples of organizations who saw in him, in our father, just a unique array of skill sets, and just his personality, his very warm personality. They wanted to associate, and his intellect, that they wanted to be associated with their organization. So that's what was our house. A lot of issues were talked about at our Shabbos table. Various individuals, particularly Israeli dignitaries, came to our humble house in the Bronx. And I just had an interest, even in my youth, of following in certain ways in my father's footsteps, particularly within the framework of the Jewish organizational orientation.
Yeah. So, you grew up in the Bronx. I grew up in a really small town where people would say, you're the Jewish rabbi's son, right? Which I guess was very true. But for some people who are the children of rabbis, they go running off in another direction, and see all the pressures that their fathers go through, and now it could be their mothers. But So what drew you, more specifically? Did you think about, being a pulpit rabbi growing up, or?
Yeah, initially the answer is yes. We used to call them in the old days compositions, right? So I wrote a composition, I think I was in fourth grade, that I wanted to be a rabbi like my father. So initially, my goal was to become a pulpit rabbi, a rabbi in a synagogue. And eventually that's what happened. I graduated yeshiva college. I pursued my master's degree in Jewish history and received my ordination at Rabbi Isaac O'Connor Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University. Went into the U.S. Army as volunteered at the tail end of the Vietnam War, when there were Jewish soldiers in the military who needed to be served. This is a war against which I protested, but I wanted to be of service not only to our country, but particularly to the members of our Jewish faith. I served as U.S. Army, active duty U.S. Army chaplain stationed in Fort Knox, Kentucky, married to Phyllis. A few years before we went into the military. That was quite an experience being in Kentucky. And then my 2 years of required service was completed, and I was able to get a position in Springfield, Massachusetts, as first an assistant rabbi youth director of a very large congregation, the same congregation that Rabbi Norman Lamb, who became the president of Yeshiva University, held that pulpit. In a few years, I became the rabbi of that synagogue. So I achieved what I wanted to achieve in fourth grade. I got the rabbinical title, and I served as a rabbi in a synagogue and got to preach from a pulpit. So that was a kind of check off those boxes.
Yeah, you checked them off very, very well. I want to go back a little bit to Kentucky and Fort Knox. And as you mentioned, it was a very contentious time in American life, toward the end of the Vietnam War. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those experiences coming from a very Jewish environment and taking it from there?
I remember the first day that we arrived on this. They're not called bases. Bases are the Navy, where your dad was chaplaining in the U.S. Navy in Annapolis, but for us it was a post. So the first day on post,
You wouldn't have done well on the Army Navy game day.
So the first day on post, the major who was assigned to me was a non-Jewish person, Major Coates. I still remember his name, very tall, strapping fellow. And he took Phyllis and me to the PX and sort of talked to us about life on Fort Knox on the post. And he sat down and wanted something. So back in those days, I guess I drank soda. So I probably had a soda and maybe nothing else. I don't remember any longer, but I remember what he had. He had a hot dog and a glass of milk. And for me, as an Orthodox Jew growing up in the Bronx, that was a bit startling. And I was the only Jewish chaplain at Fort Knox, about 40,000 soldiers on that post. And we had about maybe 200 Jews the first year I was there, maybe 100 Jews the second year that I was there. And they were, I think, 30 plus chaplains, all non-Jews, all Christians. And it really was an eye-opening experience for me. I didn't grow up in a sheltered environment. Our neighborhood in the Bronx was not particularly a Jewish neighborhood. It was Jewish, it was Irish, and eventually it became mostly Latino, Black. But in the military, you're there with everybody. It's a just multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-faith environment. One story that we, the Army Corps of Engineers stored a sukkah for not only for the chapel, but also for the chaplain. But we'll talk about the one at the chapel. And so they built the sukkah, and I told them that we needed thatch for the roof, and the Army Corps of Engineers can do anything. So they cut branches all the time. So they gathered the branches, and there the branches are piled next to this wooden sukkah that had been stored, hadn't been used in a while, and was just put up. And one of them looked at me and he said, I looked at that pile of thatch and said, oh, I know what you want to do. You want to camouflage that thing. So just one of, again, living in the middle of America. And I guess one other story, I was eating lunch once in my brigade. I was an assistant brigade chaplain during the week, and I was counseling tens of soldiers every day. And on weekends, I was a rabbi. Anyway, so I was having lunch in the social hall in our headquarters. And again, one of the Army Corps of Engineers guys comes through and sees me eating. I'm there with my kippah, with my yarmulke, and he says, chaplain? I said, yes, sir. I said, I love Israel. I said, that's very nice. And he asked me, he said, you know why I love Israel? I said, no, sir, I don't know why you love Israel. He said, what's the capital of Israel? And I said, it's Jerusalem. He said, yeah, it's Jerusalem. And what are the three middle letters in the word Jerusalem? USA. Okay.
We'll take it.
We'll take it.
That's funny. Talking about Israel a little bit, I know that while you were at Yeshiva University, you spent a year in Israel, right, as part of your studies, or?
I spent, after I graduated in high school, Yeshiva University High School in 1966. And I was the only graduate that year out of 114, I think, who were graduated in that class to go and study in Israel for the year, which of course is no longer the case. Now, majority of the students we were a boys' school, but both young men and young women go to Israel to study for a year. Yes, that was my intention, to study there for a year. It was quite a year.
So you started a big trend that later, years later, became very popular.
Oh yeah.
But so were you there during the 6-Day War?
Yes, yes, and that was a riveting experience for all of us. Looking back at it, I think that was a foundation stone for who I am and what I have attempted to accomplish during my professional career and during my life. It solidified the role of Israel in my psyche, but beyond just that, I think the role of Israel for the Jewish people. So we were kids. I had just turned 18 at the end of May that year, went to Israel when I was 17. I had to make a decision to remain in Israel during the course of the war. I only spoke to my parents twice that year. Again, no cell phones back in those days. And the yeshiva only had two telephones. One was a payphone and the other was a phone in the administrator's office. So one's was on my birthday, and then shortly after, I had to ask permission to remain in the country, which my parents granted me. And ultimately, my older brother, David, now better known as David,
came. Mine.
Excuse me?
We graduated in the same class.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
He came. He was the president of the student organization of Yeshiva, SOY, right. And he came to volunteer. I didn't know that he was coming. The war had already broken out, but so having the two of us there give tremendous kavod, respect to our parents for allowing their two sons, and we have two sisters, our sister Debbie and our sister Judy. And to allow their two sons or two older children to come to Israel during a war. Anyway, preparing for that war, was a different kind of experience for us. So we had to dig trenches, for God forbid, if there was going to be an air raid and we couldn't get into any bunker, we had to jump into a ditch. So that's one of the things that we did. We had to learn how to use the air raid siren in the kibbutz next door to us, as well as to quote unquote man the payphone overnight, because that was the only way that we could get messages from the military command, the internal military command, as to what the status might have been or if it would have changed. And I'm not sure I mentioned it to you when we spoke, but before this broadcast, but I had the shift with another guy the night that we got the call that Israel had destroyed the air force of the Egyptian army and all the armies around. In essence, that Israel had won the war. What do you do at 4 o'clock in the morning when you get that call? The only way we had of communicating people to get into the air raid bunkers was like a trumpet. We're going to wake people up with a trumpet at 4 o'clock and say, "Hey, we looks like we won the war." But that was very meaningful to have been a recipient of that call. And then the head of the yeshiva, the Rosh Yeshiva, that night, actually the night of when when Jerusalem was reunited, spoke to us at night. All the lights in the Middle East were off. There was a blackout in the entire Middle East. You could see every star in the sky. It was just incredible. And he spoke to us about Jerusalem. And when he finished his lecture, we all started singing Shir HaMalot, the Song of Ascension, B'Shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, as God had returned us to Zion. Ayun Kachamim, we were like dreamers. We sang it to the tune of Hatikva.
Wow.
I get chill. Every time I say that, I get chills. I just got them now. Just even thinking about it. Yeah, it was quite an experience.
Yeah. Very different than a friend of mine at YU who at that time, who volunteered and got to Israel right when the war broke out. I didn't see him till over the summer until school started again, and he had his arm in a cast. And I said, "What happened?" He said, "I broke my arm when I was there." I said, "What happened?" He said, "Things were tough over there." I found out later he was sent to a kibbutz and he broke his arm playing basketball the first day he was there. So sounds like you had a much more productive and meaningful experience. Yeah. So I guess that experience in Israel is something that also brought you along toward, I want to talk a little bit about how you went from the rabbinate, which seemed like the quote, more normal course, into Jewish communal service and in a professional way. And your dad was extremely involved in a leadership role as in voluntary roles. But tell us a little bit about how you made that transition.
Well, being in the pulpit in Springfield, Massachusetts, I was given an opportunity to, well, when I became the rabbi, succeeded my successor, my predecessor, Rabbi Weisfogel, as the senior rabbi. He became the rabbi emeritus. I wanted to be of service to the community in Springfield. So I volunteered for the local Jewish Federation. And the director of the Federation, who was a member of my synagogue, also a member of the conservative synagogue, and we've actually maintained some contact over the years. He put me on the Community Relations Committee. It was a committee of the local federation and didn't take very long. And I ended up as chair of the Community Relations Committee and was given an opportunity to travel behind the Iron Curtain in April of 1983 to visit with refuseniks, Jews who had requested visas to travel, to leave the country and to go to Israel, and were refused by the Soviet authorities. and then were persecuted. They were prejudiced against in their work careers, in their personal lives. It was very, very challenging life for them. And so a number of Jewish leaders, rabbis, and others had traveled into the former Soviet Union to meet with them, to give them strength, to show solidarity with them. Speaking of solidarity, what was very meaningful for them, they always knew about the Solidarity Sunday for Soviet Jewry here in New York. That organization was eventually combined with JCRC, at the end known as the Coalition for Soviet Jewry, originally the New York Conference on Soviet Jewry. Okay,
Right.
my late father, Rabbi Israel Miller, was one of the founders of the Soviet Jewry movement. And so I got an invitation to travel behind the Iron Curtain. As I said, it was April '83, it was after Passover, after Pesach. And the rabbi who I was going to be traveling with, regrettably, for very valid reasons, had to cancel. And I still remember, without mentioning their names, so not to embarrass them, but the directors of the NCSJ, National Council of Soviet Jewry, saying to me, "Oh, you're Izzy Miller's son. You can handle it." Okay. And so as a young rabbi, I flew to the former Soviet Union.
So
And
you were the only student to go to Israel for the year in your class. You were the only rabbi among 40,000 people at Fort Knox. So I guess you were used to these kind of solo adventures.
yeah, solo, you don't know how solo you are until you land in Moscow airport, and go through customs, which essentially is an interrogation. And I was admittedly smuggling into the country Judaica of all different sorts, books, scrolls for mezuzahs, straps for tefillin, all different kinds of things that I was smuggling in. And I had to get through customs in order to accomplish my mission. So I figured something out along the way. And on the plane, I had to fly to Munich, to Germany, and then from Germany to Moscow. I had in an address book, I had the names of the refuseniks, but I just had their phone numbers. I didn't have their addresses. And I'm a big sports fan. One of the teams that I follow, or the sports I follow, is ice hockey, a New York Rangers fan. And it was at that time, back in the mid 80s, that Scandinavian players started playing in the NHL. So I still remember one of the players on the Rangers was a player by the name of Anders Hedberg. So I came up with the following idea. I was flying to Moscow, then to Vilna, and then to then Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg. So Moscow, Vilnius, Leningrad. From Leningrad, I was flying to Helsinki. So I took all the names and thought of all the Scandinavian players that I could think of, and each one of their names became a street, a Hedbergstrasse, Andersstrasse, among others, and gave them addresses in Helsinki, Finland. And so when they wanted to take my books away from me, I started, had to yell back. I had to challenge them. So I said, "You can't take these books away from me. They're for my family in Helsinki." And I opened up my book and I showed them the names of all my relatives, and Andersstrasse and Hedbergstrasse. In the end, I got everything through. The guy was so frustrated with me. I pushed back on everything. I used the mezuzah inserts as bookmarks in some paperback books that I brought with me, just to keep my mind occupied. It was nearly every step of the way. There was, I think, divine intervention. There was some miracle associated with my getting through. And those 2 weeks, by the way, the most frightening part is after you get through customs and you walk out to get a taxi, and you realize how alone you are. You
Yeah.
are on your own, buddy. You know what you need to do it, get it done. And going from city to city, meeting with just fascinating individuals, but true heroes and heroines, true men and women with beyond the courage that I think many of us in the free world can muster, to challenge the Great Bear, to challenge the Soviet Union and the authorities. And I was even taken someplace when I was in Leningrad, where they had to cover my eyes over so I wouldn't know where I was going, to meet with somebody who was in hiding, with a refusenik who was in hiding. And again, so many stories, but one of them, when I was in Vilna, we can't go through the entire story, but I met with the one family that I was meeting there with. I was assigned to the Raiz family, Vladimir and Carmela Raiz, and we couldn't speak to each other in their home. I had a magic slate that I was writing on because their home was bugged. We met she had written on the magic slate to meet me in the Jewish cemetery. We met in the Jewish cemetery, and we walked and talked in Hebrew and in English for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And then all of a sudden a man was seen over there and a man was seen over there. She looked at me and she said, KGB. And you have to run, you have to get out of here. And you think about the movies that we've all watched, and you hear the violins playing. I can't leave you. She said, don't worry about me, I can take care of myself, I'm worried about you. With her eyes, she told me what direction to run in. One thing I'm pretty good at is running. And so after all my attempts of trying to challenge her, I ran out. And as I coming to the entrance of the cemetery, it was a traffic circle, and into the traffic circle came a black car. And in Vilna in those days, maybe today as well, Vilnius, black cars were either a taxi or they were the KGB. Why there was a black car there, I don't know. That was the only car that was there. And I was running out of the cemetery at the time, being chased out by the KGB. I was going to wait for another cab to come, or hail a bus, whatever. So I said, yep, what's the worst going to happen to you? Get in the car. The car stops, I get in it. It was a taxi. It was a taxi. And he took me to my hotel.
Wow.
What was that taxi doing there? So anyway, again, there are just multiples, so we don't have the time for them. But this experience, these 2 weeks behind the Iron Curtain, plus my 6 days of war in 1967,
Right.
the lead up to that and the aftermath of it, I think that solidified, particularly at this point in time in my life in 1983, I want to work in the Jewish organizational world and step out of my role as a pulpit rabbi.
So the following year you did that, right?
Yep.
You came to.
Well, in December of '83, a wonderful friend of my father's, a fellow by the name of Charlie Bromberg, was working at those days known as NACRAC, now known as JCPA, Jewish Council for Public Affairs. He set me up with a number of people. One of them he set me up with, one of the people he set me up with was Malcolm Hoenlein, who was then the founding executive of the JCRC. I met with him in December of '83 because he was looking to hire an intergroup relations director. He didn't have one at the time. And so he interviewed me, and didn't hear from him for a couple of months. And next thing I know, in March, I get a call from Malcolm asking me whether I'd be interested in becoming his director of Israel International Affairs. So I said, how long do I have to think about it? He said, now. So I accepted that position, and started working with the JCRC in 1984. Was that it? 1974, 76, 78. So I started working at JCRC in 1984, correct. And it was April 29th, 1984. My first role as a JCRC Director of International Affairs was to fly down. I was still living in Springfield, fly down to Washington, D.C. to attend an APAC conference. Back in those days, for those who know about APAC, everybody fit into one hotel. Yeah, so that began my career. May 1st, I started getting paid, but
Right.
I got a jump start.
So you're just getting the hang of it by now, right? And I know that part of your work is leading missions to Israel, that you've led more than 100 missions to Israel.
Yes, I've led over 100 missions to Israel.
Wow.
Of,
So one of the things, you know, and we can get into this a little deeper, maybe a little later, but how much the community has changed, and sometimes in very challenging ways. And one is about American-Jewish relations with Israel, you know, and a lot of concern, particularly about younger people. So it always seemed to me, from my perch, that one of the most successful projects of the organized Jewish community was bringing people to Israel, potential leaders, civic leaders, political leaders, religious leaders, students, and others, and showing them, you know, what Israel was like, and you know, in many cases, they became, you know, very big supporters of Israel. It seems more recently that the message on such trips is come to Israel and see the complexity of Israel. I just wondered, again, you're looking over a long period of time in these missions. Does that resonate with you? Is that
very much so.
yeah.
The people whom for those who are not aware, the people whom we've taken on these trips, for the most part, are non-Jews. Once in a while, we'll take an elected official who is Jewish. But for 90+%, maybe 95% of them are non-Jews. Many of them are public officials, both elected and appointed, community leaders, ethnic leaders, not-for-profit leaders, faith leaders, some business leaders, union leaders. We know that we've had a success if at the end somebody, a member of the mission, one of the participants, will say it's complicated. There are multiples of complications surrounding the story of Israel, and if we're able to show them how complicated it is, so that they don't just accept hook, line, and sinker what they're reading in the American media, or what they're seeing online or on TV, we know that we've accomplished something. Yes, of course, we have influenced some thinking about Israel for the better, let's hope, Bezrat Hashem, with God's help. But the most important thing to begin with is to ensure that they recognize the word that you use, the complexity of Israel's existence and its determined efforts to remain the legitimate state that it is, and the Jewish and democratic homeland of the Jewish people.
Yeah. I wish we had time to delve into some of the more, you know, some of those missions and some of those experiences. But maybe if you can step back a little bit on some of the major challenges you've faced in this position. Many of us have seen you on podiums and, you know, giving talks at rallies and other formal occasions. And I'm sure that much of your work has been behind the scenes. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how you balance that.
Oh, it's behind the scenes, so I can't talk about it.
Well, nobody's watching. So.
There certainly are challenges to playing the role that I've played over the past nearly 4 decades. Many challenges. One of them is exactly what you're raising about working behind the scenes. There are really two approaches. There are quite a number of Jewish organizations. I remember walking with Benjamin Netanyahu, with Bibi Netanyahu, when he was the ambassador to the United Nations. And he said to me that in the Jewish world, one never gets wet. I kind of looked at him. I remember we were walking, it was on Fifth Avenue after some event, and he said, on the Jewish meeting, one never gets wet. What are you talking about? He said, in the Jewish world, there is an umbrella on top of an umbrella on top of an umbrella. The Jews never get wet. So JCRC itself is an umbrella for more than 50 Jewish organizations, a Conference of Presidents, 52 organizations, Jewish Council of Public Affairs, et cetera, 120 JCRC, Jewish Federation of North America, all these different umbrella organizations. So there are a lot of Jewish leaders who take the opportunity to get up at podiums and to give speeches and to be and to do their work very, very publicly. We decided years ago that the most effective way for us to act as an umbrella, so as not to step on the toes of the organizations who are part of our group, part of our agency, is give them the opportunity to do the public work, and we're going to do the work behind the scenes. It's not a rule written in stone, but nonetheless, it's something that we've operated with during the course of certainly in the course of my tenure at the organization. So it might be misunderstood. That's okay. And what isn't okay is some of the sharp criticism we've received. But I understand that there are at least two approaches to leadership, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, out front and behind the scenes. Okay. And we think that we have been highly successful over the years in avoiding controversies or arresting those controversies once they erupt. And it's been a challenge. It's not simple. It's not easy. And most of it revolves around something very simple, Gary, and that's relationship building. The missions to Israel, its core activity is relationship building. Of course, there is the need to educate and to inform, but we got to know who these individuals are. Some of them might be business. I remember John Liu was a Chinese businessman when we took him to Israel on a mission. He became a New York City council. And became the first Asian ever to hold a citywide office. He was a New York City comptroller.
Right.
And now he's a New York State senator. So, and again, somebody like Greg Meeks, who's now the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, his first trip to Israel was as a New York State Assembly member. Similarly, with regard to Hakeem Jeffries, similarly with regard to Grace Meng. It's not just informing them, educating them, it's also building relationships with them. And those relationships are very solid and very, very deep. So calling somebody, it doesn't have to be the names that I mentioned, could be multiples of names, including the mayor of the city of New York, the governor of the state, our US senators, members of Congress, and the state assembly, state senate, New York City council, and calling them and saying, this is something I think you should be aware of, or we need some assistance in regard to this matter. Not in the New York Post, not in the Jewish Week, not in the JTA, but again, behind the scenes, just giving proper guidance. And I think that's earned the organization significant respect and has led to the reputation, thank God, that the organization has been able to build.
Yeah. I'm sure among the challenges, probably one of the most difficult was the time of the Crown Heights riots. And I wonder what lessons were learned from that. I know there were a greater emphasis on those kinds of relationships with various communities. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that experience.
There was a searing experience for all of us. Um, we don't have enough time to go into all the details, but it was something which was brewing over a period of years. I remember I was a very young executive when I first got this job in my 30s. And we had a meeting with Ed Koch. You know, I meet with Ed Koch. It was like a larger than life character, a larger than life figure. And we were talking about Crown Heights. I was a number of our Jewish organizational folks and myself with the mayor, and I referred to Crown Heights as a powder keg ready to explode. And somebody did explode at that meeting, and it was Ed Koch who tongue lashed me for even using that term, powder keg. It was a powder keg, and it did explode. Um, but how do you pull it back together again? Uh, and really, thankfully to the UJA Federation of New York, they provided JCRC with a grant. Back in those days, $100,000 was worth a lot more than it is today, but provided us with a $100,000 grant to split our domestic division, which is led by David Pollack. David continued to work on the government relations and security side, and we hired Rabbi Bob Kaplan to be our director of intergroup relations. And Bob worked his magic out in the field, but particularly in Crown Heights, to rebuild or to build anew relationships between the general Jewish community and the Black and Jewish communities, the Lubavitch, the Chabad community, but most importantly is the relation between the Chabad Lubavitch community and their Black neighbors through a project called Project CARE initially. And that was really a very important milestone in the history of the JCRC, and I think in the history of the Jewish community of New York. There have been flashpoints over the years, but nonetheless, there hasn't been an eruption like we saw back in 1991. And obviously, as the executive of the organization, I played my role. And our team are just outstanding professionals who are just amazing at what they do. They're awesome, played their role. And again, sometimes there are comments that are made in public which aren't necessarily reflective of what's really happening. And I'm confident that the role that JCRC played post pre riots, and then David Pollack, I know, was out in Crown Heights quite often. I was out in Crown Heights, but post riots, yeah, I think that we helped and assisted in ensuring that relationships would be improved upon, and I believe they have been.
So while you say that, it's also, I think, pretty much recognized now, statistically, anecdotally, that anti-Semitism has, reared its ugly head again. People attribute it to the political climate. Some point to where it's coming from the left in regard often to Israel. Others point to the right and white supremacists, etc. But whichever way you look, it seems like one of the only things they have in common is their hatred of Jews, which, I think many of us thought at this point in time in the 21st century, we wouldn't be dealing with it in America that way. I just wondered your thoughts about that. Are we overreacting, or what do you think's going on?
No, I don't think we're overreacting. I always wanted to shield my children from anti-Semitism as they were growing up. And I believe that for the most part, during their upbringing, that they were not exposed to significant, palpable anti-Semitism. Well, that is no longer the case. So now more for my grandchildren than it is for my children to see the degree of hatred directed towards our Jewish community, both here in the New York metropolitan area, across the country, and around the world. If there is no solution, Gary, if there was a solution, it would have been arrived at thousands of years ago. It's a reality. It's more akin to a virus. It's very difficult to eradicate viruses, and there is no vaccine. The best approach that we have found is the relationship building. You know, we are, for God's sakes, a community relations organization. And I've always I've said this. My staff will hear this and they'll roll their eyes. There are two ways of pronouncing our name. We are the Jewish Community Relations Council. So for the Jewish community, we need to relate each other one to the other. But we're also the Jewish Community Relations Council. We are the Jewish community, and we relate to the non-Jewish community as well. A lot of anti-Semitism is born because of the lack of knowledge as to who the Jews are. We talked before about Israel, about informing people about the complexity of Israel. Well, our Jewish community is complex as well. Our culture is complex. Our religious practices are complex. And the more that people know who we are, I believe that's the best potential. It's not an antidote, but it's a salve to see what can be done to slow down, if not to eliminate. I'm not sure we can eliminate it, anti-Semitism. So as a community relations organization, that's central to our mission. It isn't combating the anti-Semitism such as what the ADL does. Yeah, we do a little bit of that, but it's more preventing the anti-Semitism by building those relationships, by ensuring that there is dialogue, communication, correspondence between us and the non-Jewish world, while at the same time ensuring that we internal to the Jewish community also communicate with each other. And that's one of the problems that we have found. There's been a high degree of polarization in America, around the world possibly, but we're going to focus on America. Look what's happening or isn't happening in Congress because of the impasse between the Democrats and the Republicans. Back in the day, we would say, yes, we can disagree, but we should disagree agreeably. Right now, the disagreements generally devolve into demonization of those who disagree with us. And that's not only between the Jewish and the non-Jewish community, that's internal to the Jewish community. My father would always quote that you would remember, of course, that cartoon character Pogo. And in Pogo, who is more of a philosopher. Excuse me?
About the enemy.
Right.
Yeah.
I've seen the enemy, and the enemy is us. We need to address the internal enemy. The internal enemy, it was addressed by the rabbis, by our sages years ago, known in Hebrew as sinat chinam or sinas chinam, of pointless hatred. And there regrettably is too much of that. We see it here in America. We see it in Jewish communities around the world. We certainly see it politically. We see it in Israel. That's something which needs to be addressed. Go back to the very name and mission of this organization as a community relations organization, trying to bring people together to communicate with each other, even if they disagree fundamentally, principally on issues.
So that is, you know, a very heavy burden and challenge. I know in my experience at the Jewish Week and in covering American Jewish life for a very long time, that was a message that was the one we always, you know, spoke of, is trying to to be the bridge to connect different elements of the community. And sometimes when we were beat up from the left and the right, I thought, well, maybe that's a good thing. They, we're bringing them together in some way. But in more seriously, the recent Pew report, as you well know, is reflecting that increasing gap within our community, where we have two extremes, particularly among younger people, where there's a significant group that's moving to the right religiously, and a significant group that we call the nuns that are not affiliated. So it seems the challenge for, what Netanyahu referred to well as the umbrella group is that much more difficult. I mean, where do we find that common ground where we can even get people to get together and argue with each other? I mean, the rabbis of the Talmud are a great example, right? They argued about everything, but they did it respectfully for the sake of heaven. I worry about what motivates a lot of the disputes in our community today. So as you're about to become, CEO emeritus, what advice do you have for all of us and for how the community can continue to operate? Or are we getting past the point where we have, umbrella groups that are trying to unite us?
A very tough question. The Jewish community has evolved over millennia, and we're experiencing an evolution right here in America and in New York. We need to recognize that. And one of the reasons why I've decided to step aside as the executive vice president, CEO, essentially the executive director of this organization, is that another generation needs to step in and take leadership. It's not uncommon. Maybe we spend a lot of time on it and analyzing it, but it is not uncommon for young people not to want to do what their parents did. Maybe I'm an exception to the rule. You talked about it with rabbis' children. It's not just rabbis, it's preachers' children. A lot of studies have been, psychological studies have been done about it. But okay, the organizational structures that have been in place over all these years, yeah, they've been in place over all these years. It doesn't mean that they are permanent fixtures. So what is the next step? And I think that we communally, and my successor and other successors, the successor generation needs to ensure that we keep an open ear to what the younger generations are saying. It isn't enough for me to say, oh, I don't want to be part of the organizations that my parents and grandparents were a part of. Okay, but how do you want to identify Jewishly? And you're right, Gary, the most troubling part of the Pew study are the just Jewish part of our population. Or they just know that they are Jewish, but it doesn't mean anything to them, just Jewish by heritage, not Jewish by any degree of culture or practice. I think we've taken too much of a laissez-faire approach to our young people, and we really do need to engage them. I just use one example. You talked earlier on, you referenced earlier on about rallies and hearing me standing at podiums at rallies. Rallies are rare nowadays. We did a rally, I guess, of sorts, the March and Rally on January 5th, 2020, in partnership with UJA Federation, as many of our major projects are in partnership with UJA Federation. We marched across the Brooklyn Bridge, the no hate, no fear. Why? Because the culmination of anti-Semitism reached a point where we sensed that people wanted to move away from what we're doing now, to move away from their computer screens and to take to the streets. Back in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, there were no computer screens. There was no alternative. And so other than watching television or listening to a radio, what alternative do you have? But there's a march, there's a demonstration, there's a rally, I'm going to be there. It's referred to as a kind of the Soviet Jewry orientation. I had a conversation with Rabbi Haskell Lookstein about that just a week ago. I think we need to adapt. The Jewish world needs to adapt to the realities of today. And hopefully that younger mindset will make its way. There will be individuals who will rise within the ranks of that mindset of those generations who want to take positions of leadership, but leadership from within rather than top down, more like the bottom up. There are no simple solutions to this. Like, we can't eradicate anti-Semitism. There's no panacea here that anyone has been able to identify, nor should we spend all too much time decrying and tearing our hair out that this is happening. Well, do something about it and try to find those Yechidei Skula, those unique individuals within those ranks who can rise. I have seen them. We've tried to empower them internal to JCRC, and I've seen them in other organizations as well. I believe that the time is coming very, very soon where we're going to see, of course, with my successor, but we're going to see others stepping into positions with a different, younger, and a more adaptable orientation to the importance of having a Jewish presence here in America, not as individuals, but as a collective. And that really is a crucial message which needs to be communicated.
Well, that's, I'm glad I'm glad you delivered that message. And I think it's a fitting place to at least pause an ongoing conversation that will continue over the years. And so, Michael, it's really been, as I said at the outset, it's been an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you today. And I just want to thank everyone for being with us, and thank you. Thank everyone here for joining us on this season finale of the Community Relations Corner. Michael will be honored next week at the JCRC Virtual Gala for his 36 years of remarkable leadership, which we've heard about today. And be sure to check the Gala website. It's JCRC-NY-Gala.org for details. And tune in on Wednesday, June the 23rd at 7 p.m. And to our viewers, Community Relations Corner will be back in the fall with JCRC's new Executive Vice President and CEO, Gideon Taylor. So be on the lookout for the premiere of season 2. And again, thanks to you, Michael, thanks to everyone involved with this production of JCRC, and thanks to all of you who are out there who are been watching, and shalom.